Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar, How Can Thinking and Working Politically Strengthen Your Health Commodity Supply Chain? My name is Kayla Thompson, and I will be providing technical support for today's event. Before we begin, we would like to review some housekeeping items. First, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the event. There are two recommended ways to connect to audio: computer audio or through the Call Me feature in WebEx. You can switch your preferred audio at any time by selecting the Audio and Video button at the top of your WebEx window. All attendees will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. However, we hope to hear from you through the chat feature in WebEx. Please select Everyone in the To field when submitting a question to ensure all panelists and attendees can see it. That concludes our housekeeping notes for today. I will now pass it to Shipra Srihari to introduce today's content.
Thanks, Kayla. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shipra Srihari. I'm a Health Systems Strengthening Advisor at Apt Associates on the Local Health Systems Sustainability Project, and I'm serving as the moderator for today's webinar. So thank you again for joining. I am so excited to be here today with our presenters and panelists to share with you some really exciting developments on thinking and working politically for health commodity supply chains that we've been working on at LHSS with support from the Commodity Security and Logistics Division at the Office of Population and Reproductive Health at USAID. I'd like to start by just walking you through the agenda quickly. We're going to start with an audience poll today, after which we'll have a couple presentations from myself and my colleague Tom on what thinking and working politically and PEA mean and why they matter for supply chains, and then what kinds of problems PEA can be useful for. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with 4 panelists that we're very excited to have with us today. We'll introduce them later on when we get to the panel discussion. We'll have then a presentation where we'll introduce to you a new resource that LHSS has developed, which is a primer for helping supply chain practitioners in applying PEA in their work. And then we'll end the webinar with a Q&A discussion. So as Kayla mentioned, during the course of the webinar, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Next. So we're starting with a quick audience poll. We'd like to hear from you. When you hear the terms thinking and working politically or political economy, what is the first word that comes to your mind? If you could just click on the link in the chat and then type that word in, then we'll see what the responses are from all of you and see what everyone's thinking about these terms. So I'm going to pause for a few seconds and give you all a chance to enter your responses. So hopefully you can see the box on the right side of your screen where you can enter your word and hit send. Okay, it looks like the responses are coming in. We'll wait a few more seconds so more of you can respond. Great, so we can see the results now. This is a really interesting collection of words. I see the main word that people have put in is interests, which is very appropriate for political economy analysis, stakeholders, context, money, strategic. I was also expecting to see more people mentioning corruption. I see it is a small there in the corner. So this is great to see all of the things that you're thinking about. And I think a lot of what I'm seeing in this cloud definitely align with what we're thinking about when we think about political economy and thinking and working politically. So thanks all for your responses. And now that we've heard from you what your views are on this term or what you're thinking about, we're going to go ahead and actually share with you what those terms mean next. So we're going to have two presentations now. First, I'm going to talk you through those terms, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tom Brown, who will explain to you some supply chain problems that PEA can be particularly useful for. Next. Next. Thanks, Kayla. So what is thinking and working politically? If you are thinking and working politically in the way you approach your work in development or in strengthening supply chains, it means that you're thinking and working in a way that you are well informed about the context in which you're working. And when we say context, we're talking about the political, economic, social, and cultural context in which you're working. And therefore, you are more astute in designing interventions and choosing reforms or policies which are not just technically sound, but are also politically feasible. Thinking and working politically also means being sufficiently flexible to change your approach. So as you learn more about the context and your understanding deepens, you can adapt your approach as needed. And if, for example, the context changes, again, you're flexible and you can adapt your approach as needed. So this is sort of at a high level what thinking and working politically means. It really is a mindset. It doesn't require necessarily formal training or understanding of terms. And in fact, many of you in your work may already be thinking and working politically. Next slide. So when you approach your work in strengthening supply chains, for example, or considering TA or interventions for supply chains, if you're already doing things like trying to understand what drives the behavior of the stakeholders in your supply chain and the power dynamics between them, if you're thinking about those people who hold the power will actually be willing to change the status quo in whatever way, your reforms or interventions are trying to do, if you're doing things like trying to identify potential blockers to your reforms or strategies, and you're figuring out how you can either circumvent or engage them, and again, trying to identify potential reformers that can work with you to support change, then you're already thinking and working politically. So where does political economy analysis come into this? Next slide. Political economy analysis is an approach that actually helps you think and work politically by examining the context in a more structured and systematic way. So when we do political economy analysis, we're really talking about trying to get under the surface of things and understand how things are really working in the context as opposed to what they may look like on paper. So in political economy analysis, we do a close examination of the political, economic, and social and cultural context in which we're working. And the things that we try to examine or better understand through political economy analysis includes uncovering what are sort of non-obvious facts about how things really work. And those include things like understanding in the context we're working, the relevant history or social or cultural norms that exist in the country and may influence the supply chain and the health sector. It includes trying to examine the formal and informal rules of the game. What does that mean? So formal rules of the game are generally referring to formal laws and regulations and policies that are relevant to the supply chain in this case. The informal rules of the game is another way of saying the informal social customs and norms that may exist in a country, in a society, that definitely influence how the actors in that context make decisions. And then we also, of course, try to understand the key actors in the system. In this case, we would be talking about the supply chain. So who are the key stakeholders? Who are the key individuals, organizations, and interest groups that are involved in the supply chain? How is power distributed amongst them? What are their interests and what are their incentives? So these are the kinds of things that we try to understand when we do a political economy analysis. And then what we try to do is use that understanding in order to develop strategies and approaches that can actually help us achieve change in that context. Next slide, please. So why is applied political economy analysis important for development and for our work in supply chains? Using political economy analysis can really help us figure out what is politically feasible in the context in which we're working. We often tend to think about what is technically sound or what might be a best practice, but we really need to be thinking more carefully about the context and figuring out what is realistic and feasible. So in order to political feasibility, PEA helps us think about what are realistic pathways or theories of change for achieving our intended goals. And it also helps us develop interventions and approaches that are localized because we're taking into account the various aspects of the local context that are, again, practical and that are also flexible and adaptive. So using political economy analysis really increases the likelihood that we will see positive change and also helps us avoid designing reforms or technical assistance or interventions that will likely face barriers and will not lead to sustainable change. So if we're thinking about this in the context of supply chain, you can think about perhaps designing some supply chain reforms for an upcoming national supply chain strategy that's being developed. And if you think about this from a political economy analysis lens, you'll really be able to think about the feasibility and the practicality of those reforms and think about which actually have a chance at success. And if you're thinking about using political economy analysis, on the other hand, for trying to better understand a persistent problem that you're seeing in the supply chain, by looking more broadly at the context and the political economy of that problem, you'll be able to better understand what the root causes of that problem are by examining, what factors are contributing that are related to political economy. Next slide. So on this last slide, I just wanted to give you an overview of one of the frameworks for PEA. If you've ever looked into doing a political economy analysis, you may have seen that there are numerous frameworks, and it's sometimes hard to know which one to use. Hopefully the primer that we've developed that Tom will be telling you about later will help you with that. But for now, I just wanted to share one framework that is an action-oriented framework for political economy analysis from the Policy Practice and Overseas Development Institute that walks you through a few questions when you're doing a political economy analysis. So it walks you through thinking about defining the problem that you're trying to address. So, and why does it happen? And then what can you do to actually address that problem? So if we think about this in the context of supply chain, you may start by defining your problem, something related to an inconsistent availability of stock or inaccurate data in your supply chain. And then once you have that clearly defined, the next step would be trying to unpack that problem from a political economy lens and trying to understand the root causes of that problem. Now, of course, the root causes will be a combination of factors, some of which will be very technical and operational, but by using political economy analysis, you'll also be able to unpack the political economy factors that are contributing to that problem. And in most political economy analysis frameworks, you'll see these three components here: foundations, institutions, and actors, that are part of what we try to examine in the political economy analysis. These terms may sound a little unfamiliar to you. I know they did to me when I started working on PEA, but they're really things that we've already been talking about in the last couple of slides, and some of which you may already be thinking about. So foundations really refers to long-term factors that tend not to change over time in the country or the context in which we're working. So factors like demography, geography, ethnic breakdown in the country. Institutions in political economy, it's not synonymous with organizations. It's actually just another way of referring to the rules of the game that I mentioned a couple slides ago, which are, again, the formal laws, regulations, and policies, and the informal customs and norms. And then actors, of course, are the stakeholders within the system, the individuals, the organizations, the interest groups, and really, when it comes to actors, we're trying to understand what the power dynamics are between them, what their interests and incentives are. So in our supply chain problem, we would examine these aspects of the context of that problem, and then we would synthesize, and we would have eventually a better understanding of what the root causes of that problem are related to political economy. And then we'll be able to use that understanding to actually design practical recommendations for moving forward so that we can actually achieve success and achieve the goals that we're setting out to achieve. So one way of thinking about political economy analysis in your work is, it's sort of stepping back and looking at your problem and not just thinking about a linear approach of, how do I get from point A to point B, but asking a little more broadly, how does change happen in the system successfully, and how can we work to actually achieve the change that we wish to see? So it's really moving from more of a best practice approach to a best fit solution. It's working in ways that are much more flexible and adaptive continually. So I think these slides have now given you a bit of a sense, hopefully, of thinking and working politically and political economy analysis. In order to make this a little more tangible, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Tom, who's going to talk in a little more detail about what particular kinds of supply chain problems PEA can help us address. Thank you, and over to you, Tom.
Great, thanks, Shipra. Welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar. I'm glad so many of you could join today. I'll just introduce myself quickly. My name is Tom Brown, and I'm ABT's technical lead in this field of health product supply chains. I'm going to just spend a few minutes building on what Shipra has been saying by examining this approach of political economy analysis, specifically in the context of supply chain problems. So if we could have the next slide, please. And I'm going to start off by addressing two important questions. But before I do that, I think it's probably important, just for context, to say that we are talking here about public sector supply chains for health products. And I know that the distinction can be a little bit grey sometimes between public sector and private sector supply chains. Public sector supply chains often include private sector actors. But for the purposes of this, we're talking about public sector supply chains, which we define as those which are financed and controlled by the public sector. So let's dive into these two problems. So first of all, can PEA be used to help examine any supply chain problem? Now, I would say most supply chain problems are down to a combination of operational and political economy factors. So that means we need to understand both these types of factors if we're going to solve problems effectively. It also means, of course, that understanding political economy analysis is not a substitute for high quality operational analysis. We need both. Second question, are some types of supply chain problems more prone to political economy factors than others? I think the answer here is yes. And a couple of categories of problem that I want to pull out in particular. One is problems related to the flow of money or allocation of other resources. So in a supply chain context, that could be problems related to, let's say, procurement budgeting, procurement execution. It could be problems related to staffing in the supply chain, especially problems related to salaries or other terms and conditions. It could be problems related to allocation of resources like vehicles in the supply chain. So all those issues related to flow of money or allocation of resources. The second category that I think we should consider as being particularly prone to political economy problems is wicked problems that have persisted over time, problems that have resisted prior efforts to solve them. And of course, that means there are also some straightforward, so-called simple supply chain problems, which are probably quite operational in nature and which may have straightforward technical fixes. So when you come across those, they may not be good or the best candidates for the kinds of approaches that we're talking about here. It's more the difficult or wicked persistent problems. Now let's look at how this actually might work in practice. If we could have the next slide, please. So when we start to examine a supply chain, we often start with a kind of a big sort of high-level problem like the one we have in the green box here, inconsistent availability of commodities at clinics. And when we start to think about what this might really mean, we might use a bit of logic, or we might use some information that we already have on that particular setting to identify some main categories of contributing factors. And we have three that we've pulled out here in this fictitious but quite realistic example. So some problems might be related to national level stockouts. Some problems might be related to poor logistics performance upstream of the clinic. So that could be problems related to how stock is allocated, how stock is picked, packed and delivered. There could be another category of problems related to commodity management practices in clinics. So those would be problems with inventory management, data management, ordering practices, and so on. Now, we could look at any of these in more detail, but we'll just pick one. If we could have the next slide, please. So I've picked the first one there, national level stockouts. And what we can see here is that we've got some operational factors which we've identified in this example that contribute to that problem, and some political economy factors. And if you look at what we have in the operational factors column, you can see all of those are quite likely and plausible candidates for contributing factors. But if we stop our analysis there, we can see that the kinds of interventions that we might design to deal with those problems might be quite different from the interventions we might come up with if we then move on from the operational analysis to the political economy analysis over on the right hand side. So if we just take one of these operational factors and see how that works, what shall I pick? Let's pick weak understanding of demand, which is the second one from the bottom in the middle column there. So that's often a problem which contributes to national level stockouts. If we stop our analysis there, we might think, well, perhaps the intervention we should be thinking of would be something related to capturing more data, or how we analyze that data, or how we triangulate that data with other data sources and report it into the procurement process. And that's all very important. If we dig a bit deeper, we might find there's a whole range of issues to do with the data culture across government. Why we have a weak understanding of demand? Well, there's no data culture. Why is that? Well, perhaps there's no clear incentives for people to be strong on data. That in turn could be to do with issues related to leadership on the issues of data, governance in the supply chain, and so on. So you can see that those interventions you might think about related to the political economy causes are quite different to the ones that you might come up with if you only considered the operational factors. Now, LHSS has developed this primer that Shipra was telling you about earlier, and I will say more about that later in the webinar. For now, I just want to mention that we've put a fictitious scenario in that primer that we use to help illustrate what can happen when you don't sort of do this next level analysis or go deep enough in trying to understand why things are the way they are. If we can have the next slide, we've got a summary of that scenario here. So essentially, we have a problem similar to the one I've just described. Regular medicine stockouts, although in this example, we find they are generally in stock at the National Distribution Centre. So there's a diagnosis, stockouts caused by some problems at district level to do with vehicle shortages, data, stock management, and so on. And a new intervention is designed, which seems to tackle these problems on the surface, but it's not implemented. And why not? Well, there's a lot of resistance, particularly from district level. And what we're trying to explain in the primer is that these principles of political economy analysis and thinking and working politically would have added an appreciation of some of the underlying reasons that led to those that kind of blocking from district level. So some legitimate concerns from district directors over loss of control over the supply chain, some issues to do with personal use of vehicles, some diversion of product, and also importantly, an unfortunate timing issue in this case that we've created, which is that this coincides with a public sector pay freeze. So there's general disgruntlement and perhaps less openness to change across government than there otherwise would be. So we're not saying we can solve all these problems with PEA, but we're saying we can take them into account in our design once we know about them. I think that links back to what Shipra was saying. So thank you for listening. I hope you found that helpful. Shipra, I think that's back to you.
Thanks, Tom. I hope it's helpful for our audience to see some real-world examples of how political economy analysis can be useful in the supply chain context. And to continue that discussion, we're now going to turn to our panel discussion to hear about our experts' views on the value of PEA for strengthening health commodity supply chains. Next slide, please. So we have 4 panelists with us today. I'm going to introduce them as I address questions to each of them. And rather than share a long introduction, I thought it would be useful to actually explain to you when I introduce them what perspective they bring to this discussion so that you can understand what perspective they're speaking from. So let me start by first introducing Obua Thomas Achua, who works in the Uganda Ministry of Health as a senior pharmacist. And he brings to us the valuable perspective of a government official working in supply chain who is familiar with political economy analysis. Thomas, welcome. I know you had some issues connecting. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, I can.
Great. Hello, Thomas. Thank you so much for joining today. Obua, we understand that you were involved in a political economy analysis for family planning commodity financing in Uganda. Could you explain to us how you believe this political economy analysis was valuable to increase to improve efforts to increase funding and access to family planning commodities? Over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, and good in our country here is good afternoon. I don't know whether you are also in the afternoon. In the context of Uganda, we had been formally engaged in the legacy kind of work where the technical people thought they had all the authority over the information they have and the work they do. But during the coming in of COVID-19, we later on realized that it is no longer the technical people who do the work. We need to bring in other stakeholders. And in this case, the decision-making environment now turned away from the technical people to the politicians. And politicians, what they need information to make decision. And we therefore had to realign our thinking to providing well-functional information that is well analyzed by the economist, so that by the time this information is being put to the politician to make the decision, they are confident that the information given to them is not going to be an information which will cause them political problem. So the PEA came at that time when we were struggling to know what can we do, because the whole world had a problem. So we now need to get into engaging the politician directly, and the PEA came in and helped us now to realign our thinking to packaging the right information, which is well analyzed, and then putting it to politicians to make the decision. And indeed, it came at the time when we were developing the 10-year supply chain roadmap, where we thought now as a country, we should now be able to take care of our people, because the experience from Ebola, from COVID, it taught us that sometimes you might need to do something for your people on your own. So political economy came at that time, and it allowed us to engage the key politicians from ministries, departments, and agencies of government. And by that, we were able to achieve a lot within the shortest possible time. And indeed, we were very happy for this concept of coming, doing things, talking, and working politically, so that at the end of the day, the decision made is a decision which is never challenged as it goes across the ladder of decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Obua. So I'd like to ask you a follow-up question that I'm guessing some of our audience might be curious about. Was your government receptive to this idea of doing a political economy analysis? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, actually, at that time, we had already initiated the working relationship with all the departments and ministries that are directly related to service delivery. And this was Minister of Local Government, Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, Minister of Public Service. So by the time this project was coming to the country, we had what we call interministerial meeting, where issues from the health sector was put. And this was done after analysis of the supply chain in the country in 2017, 2018, funded by USAID. And it brought out glaring gaps, which has been in the, I thought the slide were too good for me. It brought in glaring gaps, and these gaps had solutions outside the sector. And the solution outside the sector was local government, which implement government activities, Minister of Finance that allocate funding, Minister of Public Service that provide the human resources to run these activities. So it was very receptive. They said, why did you take long bringing this thing at this time when really we had been suffering? So people now knew their role, but they thought that their role could not be done themselves. It has to be brought on the table together with every expertise playing a role, so that at the end of the day, decision can be made that is useful in the key performance indicators of the world where we are taking care of the health of the mother and the health of the children. And I thought this one came at the right time, and you could not notice that government of Uganda had to quickly mobilize resources, about $6.8 million to add onto the supplies, in which had been very difficult for us to achieve. But this thing came at the right time, and we are very happy. It was very safety, and we want to continue working like that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Obua. I think it's exciting to hear how valuable the PEA has been for your government in Uganda. So thank you so much for sharing your views. Now that we've heard a government perspective, let's move on and maybe hear a donor perspective on political economy analysis for supply chains. So we're now going to turn to our next panelist, Tiffany Marshall-Cummins from USAID, who works in the supply chain field and actually oversaw the LHSS project activities on political economy analysis. She is incredibly passionate about promoting the use of PEA in supply chains. So Tiffany, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Could you please start by telling us, in your supply chain technical assistance and other work, where do you see political economy analysis and thinking and working politically bringing the most value? Over to you.
No, thank you for that fabulous introduction. Let me preface by saying that, we can recognize that one can have top grade technical assistance implemented in country, but it doesn't always translate to successful interventions that will yield high development impact and outcomes as we intended. Also, there's some value that from rolling out generalizable or like the one size fits all approach and lessons learned. But the barriers we continue to face in supply chain operations that have political economy factors, such as custom clearance, procurement decisions, distribution decisions, outsourcing, challenges in capturing accurate data, and more. Doing so to achieve contraceptive security encourage us. And when I say us, I'm referring to country governments, private sector, civil society, key stakeholders, donors, IPs, as this requires collaboration beyond donor projects to be more flexible and adaptive in our interventions, especially in prioritizing localization efforts. Political economy analyses can bring the most value to supply chain with how we design our requests for proposals, offering more flexibility with our theory of change to accommodate new learnings, even from failures, adjust our advocacy and our interventions as our understanding deepens. This can also allow us to be more effective in supporting opportunities for political reform.
Thank you, Tiffany. So if I may ask a follow-up question, what advice would you share with other donors or implementers about using political economy analysis in their supply chain work?
So when implementing the PEA in supply chain work, the PEA analysis should be ongoing with testing of assumptions, new learnings, and then adapting one's approach in your implementation. While PEAs can provide insight on pathways for change, we must be aware that incentives set by donors may unintentionally be blurring accountabilities, increasing fragmentations, and contributing to the root issues. When interest in maintaining the status quo is strong, we need to look for reforms that may be less threatening to vested interests, but have some positive impact. Since PEAs may reveal entrenched political realities that may be impossible for change or even influence, one can select the second best technical solution rather than heading down the path of the best technical solution.
Thanks, Tiffany. Your responses, I think, align well with a lot of what we talk about in political economy analysis and thinking and working politically, being flexible, adapting as we go, continually learning and adapting. PEA is not meant to be a one-time thing, but something that you continually, which is why we say it's a mindset. It's something you're kind of sort of thinking about as you go. So thanks for your perspective. Now we're going to turn to our next panelist. Bonnie Funda Funda from the Africa Resource Center, who works with a number of governments in strengthening their supply chains, and so can give us a broad perspective on possible challenges one can face in using political economy analysis in those contexts. Bonnie, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us. Tom and I were discussing with you some weeks ago your views on potential issues with the actual term political economy analysis. So we'd love for you to share with the audience your views on that term. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shipra. Certainly, I think the term itself, in some countries, and here I'm just generalizing, in some countries, it might conjure up all kinds of expectations or implications about what a service provider like an NGO is attempting to do in that country, considering that, oftentimes, if not at all times, we are working as a guest of government. And in some countries, clearly the mention of a political assessment or political analysis of an environment or a context in which we are working might create all kinds of barriers, unnecessary barriers to the work that we are intending to do. But then, look at it this way. I think if you consider the fact that every investor who is investing in a country, whether they are local investors or international, they do some sort of assessment, which includes political analysis, economic analysis, and so forth. So from that context, one can say that government is aware that anyone who is going to put money into that country or resources into that country or contribute to the national development program, and particularly even in the health sector, they'll have to do some sort of analysis, and it will touch on politics and political environment of that country. And of course, NGOs being what they are, we are not political entities, and we try to be very clear about that. So there's no expectation that we will be venturing into that kind of toxic type of political venturism, should I say. But that doesn't mean we do not make ourselves aware of the environment in which we are working in, and quite clearly governments do expect that there will be that. So I think in a way one has to be tactful in terms of a title such as political economy analysis in order to ensure that we do get working partnership with government to apply this concept. So my suggestion would be, yes, we know the fundamentals of what political economy means and what's the context of it. But in order to create an easy entry and application of this concept, one might have to consider a different title, which I can't think about now, but I would suggest that for ease of engagement with different levels of government, it may be just useful to think about a change in the title to accommodate the use of the concept. But nevertheless, this type of detailed analysis, I think it's accepted that it will be the responsible thing to be done, to be carried out by anyone who's trying to support a government or a government program. So I think we should be, from that perspective, at least be at ease with the content. But maybe the tactful use of the title might be, a change of the title might be important here.
So I think along those lines, Bonnie, if you were a government official and you learned that an implementing partner or donor were planning to conduct a PEA on a supply chain together with the government, in collaboration, and you knew that this PEA could be valuable in terms of revealing hidden barriers to some supply chain problems, but you also knew that it might reveal some more uncomfortable realities about mismanagement and corruption. I mean, how would that make you feel, or how would you react as a government official?
I think if we start from the context that this is an exercise that will be done in partnership with the host government, with my ministry in that regard, I think I would have been briefed about the concept itself and the content and the methodologies and all of these things. I think to that extent, I would be quite happy to see what the findings come up. What are those findings? I think particularly when you are looking at the fact that in our current times, our citizens, I critically keen to ensure that national interests are protected, public funds are protected, and that national programs are efficient, and systems are found that enable efficiency in delivering of public services. So from that context, I'll be very happy to see those findings, because we would have been collaborating on establishing those facts. So I'll be happy to see that some of this may be concerns that may have been thought to be without evidence. I would be happy to see those concerns translate into evidence as a consequence of that analysis. And I would be happy to see that that evidence is put on record, because then it will help with my decision making as a government entity. And in fact, what you might find is that the evidence that is presented actually corroborates some other work that may have been done. For example, in almost every country, we know that government's own internal audits are very actively looking at resource allocations, resource misuse, poor decision making that results in wastages and so forth. So you might find that these things tie in very nicely. And so I think from a perspective of being the Minister of Health, I would be happy to contribute to that by presenting this sort of collaborative type of evidence brought about through a joint activity with a partner.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thanks for your responses. And I think a lot of what you're saying speaks to the importance of doing PEA in a more participatory way together with the governments which we're working. So thank you again for your contributions. We're going to move on to our final panelist. I'd like to welcome David Jacobstein from the Center for Democracy, Human Rights and Governance at USAID. David brings us the perspective of both a donor and a PEA expert, as he's been working in political economy analysis for many years. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you could start by telling us, in your experience of being involved in many PEAs, what do you see as the biggest value add and the biggest challenge to doing useful, action-oriented political economy analysis? Over to you.
Thanks, Shipra, and thank you so much for inviting me to share the virtual stage with such an esteemed group of panelists. I'm very glad to be here. So in terms of the biggest value add, I would say more generally, as a donor, one of the ones that we see is kind of avoiding investing effort that was never really going to succeed. I think if you imagine what some of the first order answers were to some of the challenges that Tom laid out, it is very possible to imagine a frustrating time spending a lot of work where the incentive structures just wouldn't allow the solution that was envisioned to be implemented. And so I think in that sense, also because it varies, another kind of value add is that one can not put all of the eggs in one basket and pursue more than one line of effort, something often called development entrepreneurship, because even if something is paying off now, we can hedge some risk in terms of different shifts in the context by having different streams of effort. One of the classic examples to me is maybe we build deliberately more robust connections with parliamentary bodies that regulate healthcare, even if there is a favorable ministry environment, because sometimes there's a shift of ministers or deputy ministers and it can disrupt some of our plans, but maybe having backing from important MPs would still keep them high enough priority to be followed through. In terms of challenges, I think the biggest challenge probably relates to how donors and implementers tend to operate, which is a mode of kind of first design, then do, where we spend all of this analytical effort solving a large problem in advance, and then implementation is just follow through on the plan that was created. One of the more common metaphors for thinking and working politically is to plan for using sailboats, not trains, that you can see your destination and where you're going, but not necessarily map out the full course because you don't know how the currents and the winds will change, and that it's important in the ongoing implementation to be ready to tack back and forth depending on those. This can be a little harder to do because you can't as specifically say what you're going to do going forward, but it's probably more likely to get you there and to achieve the changes we're looking at if we're honest about it.
Thanks, David. So as a follow-on question, could you perhaps share a couple what you would consider key messages for technical folks who are maybe not so familiar with political economy analysis, but are considering using it in their technical supply chain work?
Absolutely. So you've spoken to kind of the first one of these, but I really want to reiterate that this is a mindset and not a product. It's less that it hinges on the right expert who can do the analysis to kind of tell a team what steps to follow, so much as it requires the entire team of change makers to reorient toward a slightly different way of working and understanding of why and how they will succeed. Um, and so we can get clarity through a political economy analysis around kind of how change actually happens, who matters to it. We can situate our project to kind of make those changes likelier to happen. But it's a different process working backwards from the context to what we're going to do, leaning more on people who know the place and the situation than on people who are technical experts who can design a solution in a vacuum. And this can upset some of the hierarchies and pecking orders that are typically present in different ways around the expertise to pursue development work. The second key message that I would say is that it does involve everybody doing the work has to accept that they're going to be making decisions amidst uncertainty. And while I think we all know that that's life and that's reality, that's not how our designs, how our project documents describe what we're doing to ourselves. And it can be uncomfortable. It can be scary to look at that. You might have, plans in one direction, and then there's completely unrelated to the sector. There's a diplomatic row with a neighbor, and support that you were counting on from a Ministry of Trade or a Ministry of Finance that was related to a particular investment plan around cross-border cold chain or something, would be altered, and you'd suddenly have to scramble and do something different. It also suggests that we have to delegate decisions to the right levels. So giving, say, a trusted subawardee more latitude to figure out how to approach some certain private sector actors and adjust reform plans based on which details they will actually support without every aspect of those adjustments being confirmed by the prime, being confirmed by the mission. And I think this is often scary for those of us who have responsibility for the success of the larger program, the people who authorize the funding, the people who are kind of responsible for these broader changes in the country, who really want the clarity of saying, well, if we do X, we will certainly achieve Y. And giving up on that certainty is more honest, but it can feel scary, and it takes a little bit of effort to ensure you're bringing people along to be comfortable with the way we will be operating in ambiguity and uncertainty.
Thanks, David. Great to hear your perspective, and I think some of what you've talked about hopefully will be very useful for our audience who's wondering about practically what it means and and what kinds of challenges one would face using political economy analysis in a supply chain context. So thanks again for your contributions. So now that we've heard a bit about some value of political economy analysis, some of the challenges we might face, I'd like to turn it back to my colleague Tom Brown, who's going to talk to us about a resource that LHSS has developed recently, which is a primer for conducting PEA in a supply chain context. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Shipra. Thanks for that great discussion from all the panelists. That's really interesting. I do want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this prior, but I also want to leave enough time for Q&A. We've got some great questions in the chat, so I'll run through the important aspects of this as quickly as I can. So we have developed a primer on political economy analysis in the supply chain context. This has been very kindly funded by CSL, which is the Commodity Security and Logistics Division of the Office of Population and Reproductive Health in USAID. We've also had some great technical inputs from an expert advisory group from the fields of PEA and from the field of supply chain. And we've looked at a lot of prior PEAs and used what we found in there, both in the supply chain field and outside the supply chain field. So it really has been an effort that's brought in inputs from several different individuals and organizations. I just want to say a couple of things about it. We've written it to be very, very practical in nature, and we want It's aimed at people who are involved in solving supply chain problems, either working in government systems, donor agencies, implementing partners. The purpose is really to help those people to design their work and their interventions in a way that will have a lasting and positive effect. So it's not an academic type of resource at all. We've drawn on academic content, but the document is in no way academic. It's very practical, very accessible. We think there's a lot of great content in there which can help a lot of people in their work. A lot of the content covers similar content that we've run through on this webinar, so I'm not going to run through every section. The link is in the chat. We can maybe just go to the next slide. I'll just pick up one or two things from this slide here. There's some really good practical stuff in these sections here about planning, preparing and implementing a PEA. So how to choose kind of a light, medium or sort of heavier touch approach, the time and resources that might be required for each of those, when each one might be applicable. Some great practical tips for things that you need to do for successful PEA, having productive conversations with people. Tips for discussing politically sensitive issues, and there's a really great annex which has got sample documents to show you how to develop lines of inquiry for your stakeholder interviews, how to structure a desk review, and some useful links to some supply chain PEA briefs which are in the public domain. So please do click through, have a look at that, use it. We think it's a really good resource and can be of practical use to many of you. So thanks, Shipra. Back to you.
Thanks, Tom. So fortunately, we do have some minutes remaining, and we're hoping we can get in at least one question for each of our panelists. So I'm going to move on now, next slide, to our Q&A discussion. And also I should mention that my colleague Kara has placed the link for the primer in the chat, so feel free to click on the link. Maybe looking at it will have you think up some more questions for our panelists. So I'd like to start with Obua with our first question. So Obua, if you could maybe in just about a minute answer this question so we can try to get in all four of our panelists with questions. Could you tell us from the perspective of someone who works in the government, how do you think the development community should think about using PEA moving forward in their work in strengthening supply chains? We've been talking about the various challenges and the use of the term. Do you have any thoughts you could share about how the development community should consider using PEA moving forward? Over to you.
Yes, my view is that everybody has a useful role to play in the decision for actions that directly affect their life. So this PEA has brought to us a thinking that not everything about health is a matter of health workers. Actually, in the planning in the country now is we need to redirect our resources to preventive health, and preventive health is done in the community. And only when it breaks down, that is when they come to the facility, to the health facility, to meet the technical people, to professionals, to handle their cases. So the idea gotten from this PEA has brought on board that as we make the decision to run some of our activities as government, we need to involve everybody in it, so that by the time the decision of activities being done is being taken, all of us have known the discussion, have known the challenges, have even known the reason why such action has been taken and such amount of fund has been put on board, so that at the end of the day, everybody is happy with what is taking place. They can appreciate the challenges which the government has, and in the end, very little complaint is entertained. Maybe they will always provide the solution as we evaluate the activities being done. So I thought collaboration and inclusiveness is the way forward, and that has been given to us by the PEA. Thank you.
Thanks, Abua. I think those are great points that you add to the discussion. So thank you. I'm going to move to David now to ask you a question that came through the chat. So one of our colleagues is mentioning that, we often employ PEA without realizing it. It's attributed to soft skills, and it can't really be measured in terms of success or consistency. So the question is, how do we as professionals make our use of PEA a little more structured, consistent, and replicative in our approaches? Over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is just to build it more into the ways that we are talking about and doing our work. For example, one of the more famous Thinking and Working Politically projects out there in Nigeria, the State Accountability and Voice Initiative, took their thumbnail sketch of political economy in different states, and when they tried to identify partners to work with in those states without using any of the terminology, they had them, in applying for funding, write a section on why is the glass half full, where they could describe how they saw it and either updating that understanding or saying why what they were proposing to ask funding for would work given these realities. I think things like that move it from a thing we talk about after work is over into something that is more formally and structurally part of what we're doing and allow teams to have conversations around it in a way. So I think that for me would probably be the biggest gain, is just having these routine, often with CLA processes in USAID, we have pause and reflects at certain periods where we're gathering stakeholders together. And too often those start with, how did the project do, or what are the numbers, instead of what is shifting in the context around us. So I think some fairly simple habits and structural building in can allow it to become more a routine part of what is seen as belonging to the work of programming in ways that allow slightly more consistency in how we carry it out, and allow some of the deeper, you can choose your frameworks, you can choose those things, can be inserted into those spaces in that way.
Right, right. Thanks, David. And I mean, I guess that aligns with what we've all been saying about this really being a mindset and, not so much a one-time way of doing things. So thanks, David. And I think we have time for one more question. I'll try to squeeze in two, but the next one is for Tiffany. Tiffany, if you in about a minute could tell us, what do you think we can do to build the appetite at USAID and amongst other donors for incorporating the resources and the time that's needed for using PEA in our ongoing, technical supply chain or other work? Over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. In complementing USA supply chain technical assistance, we can, look at the PEA findings to assist us in defining, the effective approach that we've been talking about for the past hour. But we could use it specifically, like looking at inclusion, especially at the vulnerable population, be it from a rural or urban, tribe, class, and what have you. And it could tell us how to best engage with civil society organizations and various ministries in a way that, regardless of political party is in office in the country government, that we continue to seek and incrementally increase the health budget allocation annually. Can also look in supporting country governments with anti-corruption initiatives, diversion and theft, especially at the downstream of the supply chain. There's a significant challenge that would require action at many different levels in the government, public sector, private sector, and others. The PEA can aid in tailoring what TA and budget resources should be allocated within the supply chains to support opportunities for reform.
Thanks, Tiffany. I think that's a great note to end on. We have some great comments in the chat. Thank you all for engaging. Bonnie, I'm sorry we weren't able to get to you with a question, but we're right at the hour.
No
Thank you
problem.
all so much for joining. I think this has been a great discussion. Lots going on in the chat. Just wanted to show you our primer. The link was also placed in the chat. Everyone should be receiving a recording of the webinar in case you'd like to see the link there or re-listen or share it with colleagues. So just wanted to take an opportunity to thank all of you for your time, to thank the CSL division at USAID for their guidance and support, to thank all of the people we interviewed to actually develop this primer. We interviewed a lot of PEA authors and supply chain and PEA experts. And again, thanks to all of you so much for joining us today. Have a great day. Goodbye.